10 terrifying unsolved serial murders. Number 1. The Alphabet Murders. In the early 1970s, a series of brutal killings occurred in Rochester, New York. The victims were all young girls, all had been raped and strangled to death. But there was an eerie coincidence that linked all three of the victims together by name. Carmen Colin, Wanda Wolkowitz and Michelle Mesa all had double initials or alliterative names. All three girls were from single-parent households, were Roman Catholic and had learning disabilities. They all disappeared during the afternoon and were all likely taken by car. Each was also sexually assaulted before being strangled. They were found in towns outside Rochester with the same initial as their first and last names. Carmen Colin was found near Chile, Wanda Wolkowitz in Webster, and Michelle Mesa in the town of Macedon. Initially referred to as the double initial killings, this then became known as the Alphabet Murders. The most likely suspect killed himself shortly after the last murder took place, but was cleared by DNA testing in 2007. The killer is still at large. Number 2. The Texas Moonlight Murders. For several months in 1946, a masked man terrorized the twin cities of Texarkana, Texas and Texarkana, Arkansas with a string of murders. His brutal attacks came in the dead of night and usually on weekends, often 3 weeks apart, with the use of a .32 caliber handgun. His victims were mostly young couples who had been sitting in parked cars in secluded areas outside of city limits. In total, the attacker claimed 5 victims and injured 3 more. He became known for having an almost invisible quality, being dubbed the Phantom Killer by local press, because few people ever saw him, heard him, or could identify his features. Only the first victims were able to give a description of their attacker. What they described would send chills through their small community. They described a 6-foot-tall man with a plain white sack over his head, with holes cut out for the eyes and mouth. These events became known as the Texas Moonlight Murders. The town itself became known as the town that dreaded sundown. In spite of a manhunt, widespread investigation, and a known suspect, the Phantom Killer, or Moonlight Murderer as some called him, was never apprehended. Some believe these killings were the early work of the infamous Zodiac Killer of San Francisco, who was also never caught, although this has never been proven. Number 3. The Highway of Tears Murders. The Highway of Tears relates to a series of disappearances and murders that have taken place along Canada's Highway 16, which spans nearly 900 miles of beautiful scenery through British Columbia. From 1969 up until recently, more than 40 females have disappeared along this highway. Most were thought to be hitchhikers. The highway runs through many extremely isolated areas, some which are completely deserted, with no nearby towns and no phone reception. Logging roads are known to branch off the highway for hundreds of miles before stopping at dead ends, adding to confusion in police investigations and searches. Only a small number of victims have had their remains uncovered, while others have vanished without a trace. It is likely that more than one murderer roams the Highway of Tears, with some victims being linked to dead serial killer Bobby Jack Fowler. But aside from this, no killer has been caught yet, and to this day the highway continues to act as a vast killing field. Number 4. The Cleveland Torso Murders. The Cleveland Torso Murders were committed by an unidentified serial killer who killed and dismembered at least 12 victims in the Cleveland area in the 1930s, although evidence suggests the victim count was much higher. The victims of the Cleveland Torso Murderer were usually drifters whose identities were never determined. The murderer's victims were always beheaded and often dismembered, sometimes with the torso cut in half. In many cases, the cause of death was the beheading itself. Most of the male victims had their genitals mutilated. Many of the victims were found after a long period of time following their deaths, sometimes a year or more, making identification nearly impossible. Even more difficult since the heads were rarely recovered. Several suspects were interrogated, including a well-known doctor and World War I veteran, but the murders were never solved. Number 5. The February 9 Killer. On February 9, 2006, in a suburb of Salt Lake City, a Hispanic woman was attacked and murdered while alone in her apartment. 2 years later, on February 9, 2008, the same thing occurred to another Hispanic woman in the same area, only a mile away from the first crime scene. Both women had been strangled. Both apartments showed no sign of forced entry. Although at first the repeated circumstances were thought of as merely coincidence, DNA analysis of evidence collected at both scenes proved that the murders were committed by the same man, who became known as the February 9 Killer. Few suspects have been identified, and no arrest has ever been made. Number 6. The West Mesa Bone Collector. In February 2009, a woman walking her dog through an area known as the West Mesa in Albuquerque, New Mexico, discovered a human bone. She reported it to the police, and what followed was an investigation which eventually uncovered the remains of 11 women and 1 human fetus. The West Mesa became the largest crime scene in US history, the dumping grounds of an unidentified killer known to locals as the Bone Collector. All 11 female victims were prostitutes, and all were eventually excavated from the same area. In the years since this grisly finding, no further evidence has been uncovered, with the causes of death being listed only as homicidal violence. There have been no possible suspects, no DNA, no potential murder weapons, no possible eyewitness descriptions, nothing. The local residents still live in fear. Number 7. The Black Doodler. The Black Doodler murdered 14 gay men between January 1974 and February 1975 in San Francisco. 3 more were attacked but survived. At the time of the killings, the Zodiac murders were still highly publicized in the media, and as a result, this case became overshadowed and became lesser known. The Black Doodler carried out his murders by gaining entrance to his victims' homes as a companion, then proceeded to sketch a drawing of them before finally stabbing them to death. The crime scenes were described as being barbaric, with areas being drenched in blood and bodies being found slashed, mutilated and butchered. It became apparent that the murderer was acting on a very deep hatred of his victims, and his act showed an uncontrollable rage. In spite of living witnesses and evidence, the case remains unsolved, partly because the survivors refused to reveal themselves by testifying against the prime suspect, since some of them occupied prominent positions in politics and the entertainment industry. To this day, the killer remains unknown. Number 8. The Craigslist Ripper. The Craigslist Ripper, also known as the Long Island serial killer, is believed to have murdered 10 to 17 prostitutes over a period of nearly 20 years and dumped their bodies along the Ocean Parkway of Long Island in New York. The first of the human remains were discovered in 2010 during a routine training exercise by a police officer and his dog. Days later, more bodies were uncovered. Some of the remains were found in decomposed burlap sacks, while other body parts were found embedded separately in the ground, including human skulls and human teeth. Many of the victims have not been identified. Police are still grappling with the idea that the crime scene served as a dumping ground for possible multiple serial killers over the years, and believe the human remains at this site may hold clues to remains found at other murder sites within New York. Of the 10 bodies found since late 2010, the 4 discovered in December 2010 have been identified as missing prostitutes who all advertised their services on Craigslist. They had all been strangled to death and their bodies wrapped in burlap sacks before being dumped along the parkway. All are believed to have been killed elsewhere. The killer is known to authorities as Unsolved, or unknown subject. Many believe he is most likely a white male in his mid-20s to mid-40s, who is very familiar with the Long Island area and who has access to burlap sacks, which he uses to contain the bodies of his victims. He may also have knowledge of police investigation techniques, which have so far helped him evade capture. Some believe he may even work in law enforcement. Number 9. The Redhead Murders. From the late 1970s into the 1990s, at least 11 females were found murdered across the states of Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania. The victims, many of whom have never been identified, shared very few similar physical features, except for one, which is that they all had reddish brown hair. One had been killed by a blow to the head, another had been stuffed inside a refrigerator at a county dump, others had been murdered by shooting, strangulation, and stabbing, indicating that the killer was not ritualistic about his murder method. Most of the bodies were abandoned near or along major highways. It is believed they were hitchhiking or had been working as prostitutes. Psychologists have stated that the possible killer was killing to either rid himself of something he hated or to get back at something he could never have. Perhaps a red-headed love interest, or red-headed former love, which explained his preference for victims with red hair. Very little is known about this case. Most of it is strung together by speculation, and police have never been sure of all the details. Number 10. The Flat Tire Murders. The Flat Tire Murders refer to 5 connected unsolved murders that occurred in Florida in 1975. However, the exact number of murders attributed to this killer have not been determined, and some estimate the figures to be much higher. All that is known is the killer's preferred method of preying on his victims. Police believe the killer deflates the tires of his victims' vehicles and then offers them assistance before murdering them in cold blood. The suspect has been given the name the South Dade Killer because the killings have taken place in the South Miami-Dade County area. To date, it has been confirmed that the South Dade Killer has murdered 5 women from South Florida, all in their 20s or younger. But California police have suggested that the suspect was a single killer who moved coast to coast and was responsible for more than 30 unsolved murders across multiple states. According to police, the killer is most likely to be very intelligent and has above average strength. His method of killing has been a combination of a gun, ice pick, and hammer. 3 of the 4 victims found could not be immediately identified due to their severe disfiguration as a result of their brutal attacks. The motive behind the murders has never been established, and it is presumed the killer is still on the loose in the Miami area.